One of the things with ADHD is it's hard to, like, the emotions we experience are so great. You know, we feel things in some ways greater than people who don't have ADHD. So it does become very challenging. And one of the best, at least like that I've experienced and research shows, that meditation is one of the best sort of medications for ADHD long term, and creating that pause and that impulse control.
You're listening to the Recovered Life Show, the show that helps people in recovery live their best recovered lives. And here is your host, Damon Frank.
Welcome back to the Recovered Life Show. I am joined today by our favorite marriage and family therapist, Jamie Whitney. How you doing, Jamie?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Great to have you back on the show today. I know the last time that we met, we talked about anxiety and depression in recovery, and we'd had a subsequent conversation via the phone, and we were talking about ADHD. And I thought, wow, what a great show to talk with you about what is ADHD and how does it affect your sobriety. And you've got a personal experience with ADHD, correct?
Yeah. I was diagnosed formally when I was, I think, 12, but struggled my whole life with it, and was always just told that I was bad. And, you know, I always got in trouble for standing up in class and talking, and just like the hyperactivity component as well, like I really suffered from. And it really was detrimental to me throughout my life, especially as I got into grad school and was able to sort of reflect on that. So from 12 on, I was put on medication, but not given any tools. So that's a big component, I think, when you're dealing with ADHD.
So as a therapist, how do you identify if somebody has ADHD? Because honestly, I think in today's hyper-connected technological world, with a cell phone in your hand and everything beeping and people calling and so much screens everywhere, isn't everybody a little bit ADHD, right? Everybody's a little distracted. And when I think about ADHD, I'm thinking about people that are kind of bouncing off the walls, can't do any kind of tasks. Is it that, or is it something different?
So it gets tricky. So there is a criteria in the diagnostic manual that therapists and psychiatrists utilize, and we look at different criteria, and if those are met, along with some diagnostic testing. So in order to formally be diagnosed, you go through a battery of psychological tests. And really, like when we're looking at kids, we try not to diagnose it under 12. But kids are getting diagnosed younger and younger. But with technology, our brains are not meant to necessarily take in all this information. And so it does create this hyperactivity, this like addiction to the dopamine. So some of that can mirror ADHD. So when we're looking at, especially with adults, like how much does it impact your life? Is it impactful enough that it causes a lot of distress? And there's the inattention and the hyperactivity, like the inability to control impulses is a big part of that.
So sobriety, obviously, I'm just thinking about ADHD pre-getting sober, right? Do you find that a lot of people that are in recovery find out that they have suffered from ADHD?
I believe so. I mean, a lot of people with undiagnosed ADHD self-medicate because your brain is moving oftentimes so fast, and your thoughts are coming so quickly, and it's distressing. And you're told that you're bad, and that you get all this negative attention when you're not really able to control it. So hence the self-medication as well.
And then when you get into sobriety, right, when you get into recovering, you say, well, you know what, I'm going to now get sober, and you start to get sober. How does ADHD hurt that process? You talked about impulse control, and obviously a lot of early, all of recovery isn't about impulse control, obviously, but early recovery is about impulse control a lot. It's feeling this feeling, it's overwhelming, you want to act on it, and you have to create this pause. I imagine with ADHD, that becomes quite difficult.
Yeah, because one of the things with ADHD is it's hard to, like, the emotions we experience are so great. We feel things in some ways greater than people who don't have ADHD. So it does become very challenging. And one of the best, at least like that I've experienced and research shows, that meditation is one of the best sort of medications for ADHD long term, and creating that pause and that impulse control.
What are some of the signs and symptoms if you're sober, and you might have been sober a long time, right? Because I know a lot of people who were sober a decade and realized, wow, something's up. Just like the episode we did with anxiety and depression, obviously getting sober is not the cure-all for everything in your life, right? Matter of fact, it actually sometimes is the introduction of the awareness that other things are wrong, that are going on, that aren't working right in your life. But what are some of the signs that if they thought, well, I was kind of all over the place and I had a hard time keeping my attention, and a lot of these ADHD signs that I see, maybe they were prevalent when they were drinking or using drugs, but now that they're sober, what should they look for?
I think it's, similar signs and symptoms, and always go and see a psychiatrist, because you want to be properly evaluated. If you're seeing a therapist, have that be the first line of defense, and then go to a psychologist, or psychologists are the ones that do the testing. So go through that formal process so that you can actually get a formal diagnosis. Because
is it typically, though, that people don't see, they see just an inability to keep attention long term?
There's so many different factors. I mean, there's inability to keep attention. If you're driving, do you easily distract? And, there's two parts to that. Like, there's that hypnotic state that you get into when you're driving. That's normal. But do you just completely go to your phone, or do you forget that you're driving? Do you lose things all of the time? Do you have really poor time management? Do you have a hard time remembering things? Do you have the inability to, like, kind of control the impulse to say something, or to, in a meeting, like to sit through the meeting? Like, do you just get up and walk away? There's so many different sort of signs and symptoms, but, some of the big ones are inability to sit still. And that gets a little bit tricky as well, because anxiety and ADHD are so closely kind of linked, and it is sort of hard to tell in some cases, like, what is really the cause. Is it the anxiety? Is it the ADHD? Are they working together? Did one come from the other?
Yeah. And I think too, what you see in early recovery, and I think it's kind of normal with people that, especially if they've had a long past of addiction, right? When they first get sober, they have a hard time doing basic functions, right? So everybody has experienced that, that's in recovery, maybe even for, depending on how old you are, when you come in and how long you were in active addiction, there might be a year or two, maybe even longer, where you might not be able to operate at your full capacity or what's possible for you. Right. And being able to kind of take it easy on yourself and to understand it's like, hey, I'm in early recovery. My mind's kind of all over the place. I need to kind of take, cut myself a break, really. Right. I think is important. But I think when you're talking about ADHD, I think that this is important too, because there's a lot of people that they're past that stage, right? But they're really not able to concentrate long enough to get their work tasks done. They're not able to take care of basic things in their life like paying bills or whatever because they're constantly distracted. They're unable to really kind of work off a to-do list, right? And it seems to me that that's maybe a sign. I know you're the therapist. You would have to tell me that's kind of a sign of like, hey, something might not be, maybe this just isn't recovery totally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that initial phase, like you are getting your brain back. And so it's hard to say whether or not you have ADHD early on in sobriety. So it is important, I think, to kind of, like you said, cut yourself some slack, and, the memory comes back. The ability to like sit and calm and manage your anxiety, it all comes. But yeah, as you get into later sobriety, ADHD affects your executive functioning. So things like you were talking about, like basic tasks and the ability to complete those, that's definitely a sign to, look a little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm. You talked about meditation being a real game changer when it comes to ADHD. Are there other things that you can do? What is the recovery path with ADHD?
There's no solution, but, there is medication and there is tools that you can learn to help manage your life. So meditation is a way that you can help with focus, with pause, impulse control. And then, if you're like, for example, when I was in grad school, I realized I had never really learned how to study for the way that I learned. So I went and I got an educational therapist. And I worked with the educational therapist to help me learn how to manage my schedule, how to study, things that, nobody knew that I didn't know, because I was really good at just getting by. I didn't want people to know that I didn't know or that I didn't catch everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I would assume that, look, most people that are in recovery are, if they've had an active addiction for a long period of time before they get sober, right? They're really good at playing the game, at, making excuses, covering up things, right? And so when you have ADHD and you really have an executive functioning issue, I imagine too, as your life starts to unpack and you become more and more emotionally sober, let's say, I would say that becomes more prevalent, that something is maybe not right.
Yeah. And really with ADHD, it's a spectrum. So when you're looking at how it's impacting you, it's like the level of distress that you're experiencing. Is it so distressful that you can't get anything done? Then that's really a time that you want to take action. If it's just stressful that, you can't get some things done, there are kind of intermediary steps that you can take. You can start meditating. You can start implementing different time management skills. It's not fun to have to kind of hold yourself accountable, and that is hard with ADHD. But when you have ADHD, structure is the most important thing for you to have, even though it's the thing that nobody who has ADHD wants. So a little tricky there.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, the inability to be able to focus for a large period of time. I mean, I know over the years, I've been able to focus more and more and more and more and more. And I'm a pretty upbeat person, right? I don't know if I would necessarily call myself ADHD, but there are close friends that I have that I would actually really kind of diagnose if I had the ability to do as ADHD, just really the inability to hold focus for any period of time and then rationally discern what they need to do next in a sequence, right? And I see how that affects their life. With your personal experience, did you just get to a point where it's just like, okay, I've got to do something?
So when I was younger, I didn't really have a choice. I was put on medication because I was getting in so much trouble at home and in school. And then when I went to college, I decided I didn't need it and I didn't want to have the stigma of it. And then when I was in grad school, it caused so much distress and so much like school trauma came back up around, how hard it was for me to learn and the trouble that I had. so it was so distressing that I needed to really take action at that point. And that's during that time I did a meditation practice, began a meditation practice, and started taking medication, and it helped dramatically.
Yeah, medication seems to be a very controversial issue in sobriety. We talked about it a little bit in our anxiety and depression episode. And I think this is even more so with ADHD, because I think we all know people who have their first high actually was an ADHD medication, right? So a lot of people link having addiction issues specifically to being put on ADHD medication when they were children. Do you find that?
Yeah.
I mean, do you find that to be the case as a therapist, or is that not the case?
I don't know. I don't necessarily have enough data to say yes or no, but from what I understand, there is a higher incidence of addiction when there is not treatment for ADHD. And again, it depends on how old somebody is when they are medicated, and all of the support around them. Like, do they have the support and kind of presence of the family and resources that are needed?
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to clarify, both Jamie and I are not doctors, right? So we're not prescribing medication or telling people they should be on medication. That's their personal choice. Can you describe, though, just in general, the medications are a stimulant for the most part, and so somebody without ADHD would receive this medication. They wouldn't respond the same way as somebody who does not have ADHD. The stimulus actually makes the person with ADHD calmer, correct?
Right. So usually when somebody with ADHD takes the medication, they're able to focus, they feel more stable, calm, versus somebody who doesn't have it does get activated and does get stimulated.
Yeah, I found that odd at first. When I first heard that, I said, wait, that can't be right. So what you're saying is you're giving somebody a stimulant to calm them down. So obviously this has to do with the neural pathways in the brain and how we chemically respond, right? People that suffer from ADHD have this thing where it's really hard to do these executive functioning. The medication then basically, and anybody here that's exploring medication on this, and again, we're not saying you should or shouldn't take it. That's your personal choice. But anybody exploring it, it doesn't really make a person with ADHD more hyper, right? It doesn't make them high. It actually calms them down, which would lead to why maybe a lot of people that have ADHD early on and it's untreated end up having addiction problems, because they're either trying to slow down their body or speed up their body in order to kind of feel like they have some sort of balance.
Right. Because there's sort of two settings often when you have ADHD. It's like gas pedal is all the way down, or you're exhausted, can't get out of bed. So it's when you're unmedicated. So it is hard to kind of find a middle ground.
Yeah. And I think, I think that's got to be torturous, especially when it comes to impulse control, because I would see that ADHD would be a huge factor of relapse with people who've been sober long-term that feel like they just really seriously cannot somehow, I guess the word that I hear from people with ADHD is this, I just can't pull it all together. Right? I just can't, I have all the things in my life. I should be able to pull it all together. I'm sober. I'm working a program, if they're in a 12-step program, or they're going to therapy, or they're doing whatever, they're doing everything that they need to do, but they still feel that they just cannot work off a to-do list, or executive functions all messed up. They're confused a lot. They can't work things in sequence. Right. And I think that these are all signs that there might be, something else going on. What if somebody's listening to this and they've had this issue and they're like, wow, this is me, what should they do, Jamie? What should they do?
if you're seeing a therapist, talk to your therapist about it. If you don't have a therapist, I recommend getting a therapist, but also checking in with a psychiatrist and figuring out how you can go through testing if that is what is prescribed. Because between the therapist and the psychiatrist, they're going to run through diagnostic measures to see if it is ADHD or if it's something else. And then I just want to kind of circle back to medication, because I've talked a lot about it, but medication is not the only answer for ADHD. There are many people, especially in sobriety, who don't take medication, and they are okay, and they find other ways that they can get things done that they need to get done, and they learn, different methods that work for them.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that have ADHD that have designed their life around who they really are. Excuse me, like that's who they are. Like, so they know that they're not somebody who can sit down in a cubicle for 18 hours a day. That's just not them, right? They have a job where they're out and about, they're talking to people. Short attention span things are better for them, and they have a very fulfilled life and are very, very successful. I think the key here is obviously recovered life is about living your best recovered life when you're sober. And I thank you so much for being on the show today to, going over this, because I think there's so many people that suffer from ADHD that are in recovery and it's untreated, and they're beating themselves up. Really, they're beating themselves up, and they're saying, and I hear this a lot, why can't I get my bleep together, right? Why can't I pull it together? It's like, I have everything that I need and I just can't execute anything. And clearly something's going on that has nothing to do with their sobriety, but it's this never ending cycle of I'm wrong, I'm bad, I'm beating myself up, things are never going to change. And I think that this is really an episode of hope, you sharing your story that things can change.
Absolutely. And by knowing what you're dealing with, you can counteract the negative stories that you have going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, getting treatment for ADHD and exploring it and meditation and all the things that you'd mentioned here, I think is a great solution to really living your best recovered life. Jamie, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Keep the conversation going. Join Recovered Life, a community of like-minded people who are looking to live their best recovered lives. Membership is free, and you can apply at recoveredlife.us.